Taking notes. HabitatUnit sits down with Basil Angaga, Chief Sustainability Officer for the County Government of Mombasa, a role described as the first of its kind at Kenya's county level. Mombasa is Kenya's coastal gateway, a historic port city set on an island between two creeks shaped by trade, culture, and the Indian Ocean. It's also a city under pressure: rapid expansion on the mainland, informality, and mounting risks from flooding, coastal erosion, and marine pollution that threaten livelihoods tied to shipping, tourism, and fisheries. Angaga's work sits inside that tension, protecting a city built on the ocean while making urban systems work at scale. As he puts it, the ocean is our heritage. What follows is a record, a short conversation on how a coastal city can work to create better-built futures.
Thank you so much, Abel, for having me today and, for the opportunity to speak to your audience about our sustainability journey in the city of Mombasa. Mombasa is a tiny island city in Kenya. It's actually seated in the Western Indian Ocean with around 1.2 million people inhabiting the city. And just like many other coastal cities, we faced with a lot of sustainability challenges. And quite often, when people look at the city from outside, they usually get one thing right straight away. They think of the ocean. So sea level rise, coastal flooding, all of that. And yes, those risks are real. But what often gets missed is that for us, the biggest sustainability pressures are actually very everyday and very interconnected. One thing I always try to emphasize is that a city is a system. It's not the different projects that we're seeing. So heat, flooding, housing, mobility, waste, health, they don't sit in separate boxes in real life, even if our departments quite often do. And when part of the system fails, the pressure shows up somewhere else. So poor waste management blocks drainage, and blocked drains worsens flooding. Flooding affects health and livelihoods. And then you see the social impacts actually starts to compound. So when we talk about climate pressures in cities like Mombasa, we're really talking about how stress moves through an interconnected system. It's not about one major climate headline, but rather about how all these pressures collide in people's daily lives in our city. It's about keeping the city livable. That's perhaps the simplest way to put it. We want Mombasa to remain a place where people can live, work, and move around safely. That means managing heat, reducing the flood risk, protecting health, and making sure that development today doesn't lock us into bigger problems tomorrow. It's more about planning with risk in mind from the word go and a dispatch from the normal, reaction to disasters as they happen. If you look at Mombasa, Mombasa is a very particular city geographically. We are an island city linked to a rapidly expanding mainland, stitched together by creek systems that are both ecological assets and risk corridors. The island is dense, highly pervious, and extremely heat-prone. The mainland is expanding outward, often into low-lying or reclaimed areas with limited infrastructure. The creeks, let's say Chuda, the Portrees area, and others, act as natural drainage paths but are now heavily polluted and encroached upon. This means planning cannot be uniform. Heat management, flood control, and public health interventions must be place-specific, respecting airflow, water movement, and land-sea interactions. If you block a creek or overbuild the island, the impacts are felt across the city. This is a very important question you ask. And now that I come to think about it, I'm reminded of a recent sail that we took with a bunch of my friends along the Chuda Creek. And what we saw was quite devastating. And now I am more convinced that our informal settlements in low-lying areas are actually the most vulnerable and most exposed, and particularly those near creeks where ocean land is reclaimed for housing. These areas face flooding. They have to deal with the brunt of heat stress because most of them actually do not have indoor cooling and cannot afford indoor cooling. There's poor sanitation in these areas because that is a part of the ocean where you see raw seawater getting, directly into the ocean. And there's generally limited access to services. Economically, I'd say the port, tourism sector, and the transport sectors are highly exposed. The port sits actually at the water's edge, and our tourism infrastructure occupies some of the primest coastal land. And, if there was any hazard coming from the ocean, then there would be, of course, the most impacted as well. And, for tourism to thrive, the city has to be more sustainable, especially in the age of more eco-conscious tourists. And our transport corridors are equally vulnerable to both flooding and heat damage, and a lot of other assets, whether they are hospitals or even schools. And when these systems fail, the impacts ripple across the city, and it goes beyond Mombasa to negatively contribute to affect the national economy as well. This is a very complex one. I'd start with, streets and water. Shaded streets, better drainage, and protected water corridors. And shading is such a simple thing, but makes a massive difference in heat, in walkability, and in enhancing the quality of life in the city. And drainage corridors, especially when combined with nature-based solutions, they reduce flood risk, when making the city more healthier and more attractive. And these are changes that people feel immediately, and this is what you need to make people believe again in their city. Yeah, coordination. Coordination is the hardest. Climate risk does not respect institutional boundaries, yet our government systems often do. Aligning land use planning, for instance, infrastructure delivery, environmental regulations, and national agencies is a constant challenge for our devolved systems, not only for Mombasa. Land control and enforcement capacity also remained major pinch points, particularly where informal development intersects with high-risk zones. Strengthening governance is less about new institutions and more about how these existing ones can work together to ensure that, we address some of these governance pinch points and move together holistically as, one government working for the betterment of our cities and for the betterment of our people. Our options are quite clear. We focus on everyday systems, waste management, energy use, transport, water, and small improvements across these systems add up really quickly in a city of our size. And so for us, we know that growth is coming, whether we like it or not. The question is, is it going to be managed or unmanaged? And if you mainstream sustainability into how the city operates day to day, this growth doesn't really have to translate into any sort of risk for the city. Housing in informal settlements is probably one of the most complex urban challenges we deal with. And I know it's true in many other jurisdictions as well. And perhaps it's also one of the most misunderstood challenges every city faces. And these areas aren't just informal because people chose informality. They exist because cities grew faster than housing systems could respond. So what you have is high density, insecure land tenure, and limited services and livelihoods that depend on location, often close to the city's economic core. From a climate perspective, that creates real risk. Heat exposure, for instance, most of the households can't even afford indoor cooling, flooding because of the density, poor sanitation. But from a social perspective, relocation or rapid transformation can actually make things worse if it's not handled carefully. You're not just moving structures here. You are disrupting incomes, social networks that have been built for years or decades, and survival strategies that have been tested and proven, and it has sustained generations. And that's why change in this sector can feel really slow. You have to balance risk reduction with, social stability. You have to work with communities, improve infrastructure incrementally, and sometimes accept that upgrading has to happen in phases. And resilience in this context is, less about these big visible interventions and rather more about, the negotiated progress that reduces vulnerability without necessarily creating new ones or transferring existing ones to different locations. I think if Mombasa were truly climate ready, our residents would feel it first in very ordinary ways. You'd feel it in how quickly flood water drains after rain. You'd feel it in cooler neighborhoods, where shade from trees, courtyards, and green roofs, and some school compounds actually make it possible to walk, work, and rest during some of these hot afternoons when the heat wave hits. And for a mamboga who's running, say, a grocery store, it would mean her produce isn't spoiling because heat and flooding have become more predictable and we are managing better. And for Boda Boda rider, it's safer roads and fewer days lost to extreme weather. And for children, it's schools that double as safe, cool community spaces where, during heat waves and heavy rains, they could find refuge. And a climate-ready Mombasa would also feel more reliable. Waste is collected on time, so that, our drains are clear and they don't clog. Early warning messages are sent and are more practical. Energy is cleaner and more affordable, so families are not cutting mangroves for cooking fuel. Ultimately, it would feel like a city that understands itself as one interconnected system where housing, transport, waste, energy, water, and the ecosystem work together to reduce everyday stress in the city. And when resilience is working, residents don't think about climate change all the time. They just feel that the city works better even as the climate crisis gets worse. Well, I would want it to be true that Mombasa has embedded climate intelligence into how it plans, how it builds, and governs. That decisions are informed by data, science, ecosystems are valued as infrastructure, and our communities, our people are partners in resilience. Once that mindset is institutionalized, it becomes very, very difficult to reverse. And that is all we need. So for me, the signal is when I start hearing the same language being used in very different places. When a community leader talking about flooding, a county engineer planning a road, and a school principal worried about heat are all describing the same risks and pointing to shared solutions. In Mombasa, I notice civic capabilities strengthening when residents start asking not just, why is this happening? But rather, what can we do earlier next time? What can we do together next time? When communities start calling about drains before the rains, when the city teams coordinate better instead of, working in isolation, and when people trust again that, raising an issue will lead to action. Those moments tell me that the city is learning together. And when a city learns together across government and communities, it becomes far more resilient than any single project or policy could ever make it. Yeah,